Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining our briefing, What's Next? The Future of Immigration Policy 2021 and Beyond. My name is Diana Gillespie, and I'm the Refugee Advocacy Officer at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. We have a great group of speakers today who'll share their knowledge and prospects for immigration policy in the near future. We're really grateful they were able to join this important discussion, and we thank all of you for tuning in. We know it's quite a busy day for conferences today, so thank you for joining. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. This briefing will be recorded and circulated to all registered attendees after the event, so we encourage you to share it with your colleagues who couldn't make it today. There will also be a question and answer section towards the end of the hour. You're welcome to submit your questions via our Zoom Q&A box at the bottom of your screens throughout the discussion. And just one final note, this is one of many spaces we'll be discussing immigration policy. We invite you to engage with us on our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at the handle @lirs.org, as well as through our website, lirs.org, to keep up to date with our latest statements and releases. Before we get started with our panel discussion, I'd like to turn it first over to our President and CEO, Krish O'Meara Vignarajah, to provide her introductory remarks and moderate the discussion. Krish.
Thank you so much, Diana. Good afternoon, everyone. As said, my name is Krish O'Meara Vignarajah, and I am President and CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. Thank you so much to the congressional staffers who are joining us today, and to those who are interested in learning more about LIRS and our priorities for the coming year and beyond. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, LIRS is the largest faith-based national nonprofit dedicated to immigrants and refugees. We're also one of the oldest, having just celebrated our 80th anniversary last year. We began our work of welcome back in 1939, when LIRS was founded during the Second World War to assist the resettlement of Lutherans persecuted by the Nazi regime. But that mission quickly expanded, and we have since responded to every major immigration crisis, from the Cuban refugee airlift and the fall of Saigon to ethnic cleansing in the Balkans and the lost boys and girls of Sudan. During the family separation crisis of 2018, we were one of only 2 organizations tasked by the government with reuniting families. We have supported and empowered more than 500,000 immigrants since our founding, but the past 4 years have been some of the most difficult in our history. While we are heartened by President-elect Biden's dedication to rebuilding our country's immigration system, we know there is much work to do. Change may not be possible overnight, but it is possible, and that's why we're here today. As many of you know, the Biden administration is expected to act quickly on some key reversals of Trump administration policies. Within his first days in office, Biden has committed to reinstating DACA, resuscitating the asylum process, and ending country and faith-based travel bans like the Muslim and African bans. He has committed to raising the refugee ceiling from a paltry 15,000 set by President Trump just months ago to a floor of at least 125,000. The incoming administration has vowed to stop family separation at the border and to create a task force dedicated to reuniting the 666 children whose parents have yet to be found with their mothers and fathers. And Biden has announced that he will produce legislation that creates a pathway to citizenship for 11 million migrants. These are crucial life-saving changes, but they are also just the beginning. The Biden administration enters the White House at one of the most difficult times in our nation's history. The Senate majority remains uncertain, dependent on Georgia's runoff election, and a divided Senate will require consensus in order to advance any immigration reforms legislatively. And we all know immigration is just one of many issues the administration and Congress seek to address. But we believe that immigration has the potential to forge a new path for bipartisanship and much needed cooperation on the Hill and beyond. According to recent polling, bipartisan support for immigration is the highest it's ever been. Nearly 8 out of 10 Americans believe that immigration is a good thing for our country. This is not new. Immigration traditionally enjoyed much more bipartisan support than we've seen in the last 4 years. The Refugee Act of 1980, which facilitated the modern refugee resettlement program, passed unanimously. Immigration does not have to be the political lightning rod it has been in recent political history. Immigrants make our country better. They make our economy stronger. They keep America safe, as they've shown through their tireless work on the front lines during the coronavirus pandemic. To put it in perspective, 1 in 4 grocery store workers are immigrants. 72% of workers in the agricultural industry are immigrants, and immigrants represent 28% of all physicians and surgeons in the US. That's why Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service believes that now is the time to act. We can restore our reputation as the shining city on the hill. We can return to the bipartisan belief that the United States is a land of opportunity and a refuge for the persecuted. We can live up to our ideals and take the politics out of saving lives. But it's going to take work, and we look forward to working with the administration and Congress to make it happen. So before we get to the panel, I'd like to run through a top 10 list of priority areas where LIRS believes there needs to be focus and the incoming Biden administration could take action, ideally working with Congress and a coalition of stakeholders. First, we urge political leaders to ensure COVID-19 testing, treatment, and relief, regardless of immigration status. As the pandemic continues to spread across the country, meaningful solutions to address the crisis must take the unique challenges faced by immigrants and refugees into consideration. All tax-paying immigrants should be included in any economic relief package, and our government must ensure equal access to care, testing, and treatment for all immigrants and refugees, regardless of status. Second, we anticipate working closely with the Biden administration to restore U.S. leadership in refugee resettlement. We are witnessing the highest levels of global displacement in history, with nearly 80 million people displaced worldwide, nearly 30 million holding refugee status. But as displacement has risen, U.S. refugee admissions levels have sunk to historic lows. While Biden has committed to raising the ceiling from 15,000 to 125,000, we believe our elected leaders need to set a reasonable annual admissions floor through legislation, not just executive order. We need to modulate future presidents' abilities to change the ceiling unilaterally, as well as their authority to restrict admissions based on religion and national origin. And we must immediately terminate discriminatory travel and immigration bans and invite visa reapplication for individuals from these countries. Third, we must prioritize the reunification of all separated families and strengthen protections for unaccompanied children. This requires ensuring that all families impacted by the zero tolerance policy receive an opportunity to have their cases processed in compliance with international law. We must retain threatened protections provided by the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act and the Flores Settlement Agreement. We must stop information sharing between ICE and the Office of Refugee Resettlement so that family members can reunify with their children and not fear an enforcement trap. And we must pass legislation such as Funding Attorneys for Indigent Removal, FAIR Proceedings Act, which provides access to counsel for children and other vulnerable populations. Fourth, we must reinstate Asylum, which has been all but decimated in the past 4 years. That involves reestablishing asylum procedures at the border and ending policies that deny protection and due process to asylum seekers, such as migrant protections protocols, as well as reversing policies that prevent victims of gang and domestic violence and members of the LGBTQ community from asylum eligibility. We must reverse policies that implemented asylum application fees, a 365-day waiting period for work authorization, and the expansion of public charge regulations used to deter access to essential public services and resources. And we must end asylum cooperative agreements with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, which limit the ability of asylum seekers to access critical protections and claim asylum in the U.S. Fifth, we must also shift resources from incarceration to community-based alternatives to detention. because no one should be profiteering by locking up brown and Black people. LIRS has successfully demonstrated community-based interventions and advocates strongly for the broader implementation of this model as a replacement for immigration detention. To do this, we must expand holistic nonprofit programs that offer case management services and facilitate access to legal counsel, as well as safe and affordable housing. Sixth, we must provide DACA and TPS recipients a path to citizenship. Immigrants who were brought here as children and adults whose countries cannot safely accept them due to ongoing conflict or environmental disasters have long complied with policies that require them to renew temporary permissions to remain in the US. Their temporary status should be reinstated, and legislation should be enacted to provide them with permanent relief that includes a path to citizenship. Seventh, we must reduce the citizenship backlog. According to a Department of Homeland Security report, there are an estimated 9.2 million legal permanent residents who are eligible to apply for US citizenship. The next administration must remove barriers for naturalization and promote citizenship. This requires adequate funding and staffing for USCIS, the US Citizenship and Immigration Services, to ensure naturalization and family-based immigration petitions are adjudicated within 6 months or less, as well as reversing the recent policy to increase immigration application fees. We must also review the criteria for fee waiver forms to remove financial obstacles to citizenship for low-income individuals or people experiencing financial hardships. Okay, last three, I promise I'll do these more quickly. We must advance immigration, workforce, and education opportunities. Immigrants are one of America's most vital assets. It is to our advantage to help immigrants and refugees build their occupational and professional skills and transfer their educational credentials to integrate them into the workforce. 9, we must provide a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented people in the United States. The majority of the undocumented population has lived in the US for more than 10 years and are contributing members of society in every way, but lack legal protections. They form part of mixed status families whose lives are governed by a patchwork of immigration policies. We must remove the 3 and 10-year bars and waiting periods that prevent mixed status families from staying together as they process their immigration claims. And we must reestablish family migration as a cornerstone of immigration policy by eliminating the backlog for family-based green cards. And finally, we must act on climate displacement. The number of climate displaced people is projected to rise to 200 million by 2050. And yet currently no country or international body recognizes climate as a migration factor nor affords any protections for climate displaced people. The US must work with the international community to address the climate crisis, support adaptive and resilience efforts, and create a safe pathway for resettlement as a last resort. Okay, so clearly we have our work cut out for us, but we're ready to get to work. And that's why we've invited you all here today and why we've convened this panel of experts. So it's my pleasure to introduce them all to you now. So I'm going to begin, and I just want to make sure that we have most of our panelists fantastic. So I'm going to begin with Julia Gillette is a senior policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute, working with the U.S. Immigration Policy Program. Her work focuses on the legal immigration system, demographic trends, and the implications of local, state, and federal U.S. immigration policy. Dr. Gillette previously worked as a research associate at the Urban Institute, where her research focused on state policies toward immigrants, barriers to and facilitators of immigrant families' access to public benefits and public pre-kindergarten programs, and identifying youth victims of human trafficking. And Antonio Tijerino is a proud immigrant from Nicaragua and president and CEO of the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, a national nonprofit focused on promoting education, workforce development, leadership, and cultural pride through innovative programs. Flagship programs he has developed or helped found include the Loft Institute, the Hispanic Leaders Alliance, the American Project, and the hashtag We Dream America campaign, hashtag Masks for Farm Workers, which provided 1.2 million masks for farm workers during the pandemic, READ, and the Dream Lead Institute. He also serves as executive producer of the Hispanic Heritage Awards at the Kennedy Center and helped produce the Oyame Project, with the Imagination Stage. He was recognized by Forward.us for his work with migrant families on the border and is a Salinas Fellow at Aspen Institute. Lee Williams joined LIRS as the Vice President for Programs in August 2020. Prior to LIRS, Lee was Senior Vice President at the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. During his tenure at USCRI, Lee was responsible for its refugee, unaccompanied children, and human trafficking victims assistance and field operations all over the country. Lee also served as Chief Financial Officer for 7 years. Before USCRI, Lee was Executive Director of the International Institute of Akron, Ohio, a nonprofit that serves the refugee and immigrant communities of Northeast Ohio. And John Basilisi currently serves as the Executive Director of Immigration Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where he works with chamber member companies to form chamber policy positions on various issues and advocates for sensible immigration policies before Congress and the executive branch agencies. Prior to joining the chamber, John served as an advisor to Senator Rubio for 3.5 years, including as one of the senator's lead immigration advisors during Rubio's involvement with the Gang of Eight and his push for comprehensive immigration reform legislation in the 113th Congress. John is an attorney and is licensed to practice in the state of New York and Florida. Thank you all for being with us today. So I'm going to jump right in with the first question. So during the last 4 years, the Trump administration implemented hundreds of policy changes that dismantled key avenues for immigration, including asylum, refugee resettlement, family reunification, and employment. Immigration advocates have expressed the need for reversal of several of his policies immediately. And President-elect Joe Biden has already stated he will reinstitute DACA, or legal protections for Dreamers, on day one. So could each of you share from your perspective what you see as the most important immigration-related actions that President-elect Biden needs to take on day one? John, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services for inviting me to participate today. There's an awful lot that's still going on immigration-wise. The Chamber, for the past, ever since about 8 months now, we had, early on when COVID, when you had like COVID in March and everything was everyone was caught off guard. And you had agencies that were actually doing things to try to be helpful to the business community, where you saw a remote I-9 verification process, you saw extending of deadlines, you saw other mechanisms that were being developed by DOL and DHS to try to keep people here. Particularly, I think everyone remembers early on when you went to the grocery store and there was, produce in the produce section. The only meat you could find was ground pork. So, that you saw all of the State Department and the Labor Department and DHS working together to try to keep H-2A workers here, keep H-2A processing coming. And April comes around, you start seeing the unemployment numbers tick up. And then the administration just did an about face. And, it started in April with the immigrant visa ban. And then June comes along, you have the non-immigrant visa ban that impacted H-1Bs and H-2Bs and L-1s and various types of J-1s, which the chamber filed suit over. In July, you saw the college student ban that we were able to walk back within a week after Harvard and MIT sued, and the chamber was involved in that lawsuit as an amicus brief signatory. And we sued on the proclamation 10052, and we got a victory. And I don't want to say the victory was short-lived, but a week goes by, and then you see the administration, DHS issues a strengthening the H-1B rule. You see DOL issue its strengthened prevailing wage rule. Both of these rules would have, it's like, all right, well, we couldn't get the proclamation done. We're going to do this, and it's more permanent. and it's going to be just as disruptive, if not more, because these things are going to last. And then we sued on that, got another court victory, got it this week. The things that have us concerned, at least in terms of like what we want to see a Biden administration address early on, we're still waiting to see how this administration plays out what's going on. Because if they move to try to cure the administrative procedural defects that are in the rules that they recently issued, and they have more rules that are on their to-do list, which they may try to finalize, those are going to be action items that the chamber and other folks in the business community are going to have to work with the Biden administration on, because those are here and now, and they're big problems. Because if you have companies that can't meet their workforce needs, they can't continue to grow. And I think, you look at the current situation that we find ourselves in, where, we look at a K-shaped economic recovery where you have certain companies that they've bounced back. You have other companies in certain industries, you think, travel, airlines, hotels, restaurants to a certain extent. A lot of those places, like, if you don't have the companies that are keeping the economy afloat, being able to meet their workforce needs, it's going to be very problematic moving forward. So those are going to be things that we're going to need to work on early on, in my view, because I don't see any, there's no signal to me from anybody at DOL or DHS that their foot is going to let off the gas pedal between now and January 20th. So my view is we're going to have to deal with these rules. We welcome the court victories. Clearly, those are good developments. But those are the things I think we're going to have to deal with early on. Now, in terms of other things that are going to be longer-term action item lists, you mentioned DACA and TPS. The Chamber's been very involved on trying to protect these individuals and let them stay here. DACA recipients have been here for a very long time. They know no other country besides the U.S. Like, they salute our flag, they sing our Star Spangled Banner as their national anthem. There's no good policy justification for saying they shouldn't stay here. With regard to TPS, the Haitian Tps designation. I was in law school when the earthquake in Haiti happened, and I was in Miami, so I saw it firsthand. I saw, the volunteers go out and get Haitian people to sign up, because this was their way to, like, listen, you're not going to go home. We're not going to send you home. This is a way to make sure that your status, or at least your presence here in the U.S., is going to be okay for the time being. And then you're looking at El Salvador and Honduras. Those individuals, they've been here even longer. I mean, like, you talking about a TPS designation that for them has gone on for 2 decades. You're not going to send people packing after they've been here for 20 years. And, reasonable minds can disagree as to how TPS was used historically. Should TPS be used to let people stay here for 20 years? People can disagree as to that. But the fact is, the government extended the TPS designations for these individuals for that time. I mean, not to bore everybody with legalese here, but, like, at some point, they're not just relying to their detriment. Like, we're creating a situation where they're expecting to be here. Like, you pull the rug out from underneath them, it's poor form, and I'll put it that way. So we clearly want to deal with that issue and rectify it so those individuals can stay. There are many other issues where I see that the business community has been involved on that I think could form the basis of an effort. Whether it's, I've heard the rumors. I've talked to folks that are involved in the transition team about trying to get an immigration reform bill out early from the White House. Whether it's one big bill or if it's something where there's a package here, a package there, we put things together. To me, dealing with the agricultural labor issues are something where I can see bipartisan compromise on. We saw that last winter, literally almost 12 months ago, right before everyone left for the winter holiday. The House passed HR 5038, and you had a sizable amount of Republican votes, much more so than you saw with HR 6, which was the Dream and Promise Act. But with HR 5038, you had various members of Congress that were voting for this, because it's something that is incredibly important to their district. Because, and it goes back to COVID, when you don't have food and you realize like we need to get the food out of the ground or out of these slaughterhouses to our grocery store so people can eat it. Like, that's very, very important. So I think that could also be something where you see bipartisan compromise early on. There's also talk of this essential worker concept. Clearly, it's bigger than agricultural workers, but healthcare workers, the folks that are covered under the essential critical infrastructures that CISA over at DHS has created in response to COVID. That to me is also something where you could see activity early on, at least legislatively. There's also going to be significant regulatory administrative actions. Like, clearly the Biden administration is not going to want to maintain the travel bans that were instituted back in 2017 and then amended. Everyone forgets, like they amended the travel ban to add new countries to it back in January of this year. But ever since COVID happened, everyone forgot that happened. You also have the proclamations that we sued over, not just the June one, but also the April one that dealt with just immigrant visas. I could see that being something that gets pulled back by an a Biden administration early on. There's also a lot of issues involving asylum, refugee caps, and things that they could deal with early on. I could see them wanting to address those as well. There's also an awful lot of issues that like dealing with public charge rule, dealing with the health insurance mandate that was instituted and then held up in court. It all depends on how these policies were instituted. So if you're talking about proclamations, those are things that can be pulled back easily, or easier than, say, a final rule like the public charge rule that was instituted a couple of years ago. But those are clearly things that are going to be on their priority list. In terms of what the business community would like to see, to me, if you're going to get lasting change, it's got to be done legislatively. That's going to be difficult to do, not knowing what's going on with the runoff elections in Georgia. But regardless of how the Georgia elections go, we have to do this in a bipartisan fashion. And it is long past time for members of Congress to finally find the courage within themselves to meet in the middle. Give a little, get a little, pass the bill, leave everybody better off. And I know I'm going on, so let's move on to the other folks.
No, all very helpful. And clearly it's going to be a busy first day in terms of some of the key priorities you've highlighted that an incoming Biden administration needs to take on. Julia, would love your take on this.
Yeah, thank you, Krish, and thank you to LARS for having me as part of this conversation. I would echo a lot of what John said, I think, but I wanted to add and maybe expand on a couple of points. One thing that President-elect Biden has promised is a 100-day moratorium on deportations. And during those 100 days, presumably the administration is going to think through their deportation priorities. So that's going to be really interesting to watch and see what that looks like. Is it really a 100-day moratorium on all deportations? And then what do the new priorities look like? Does that mean going back to the late Obama years priorities of people who have serious criminal convictions, people who have just entered the country or just been issued a removal order? Or will there be some new approach? And what would that new approach be? What would that look like? So that's something that we're watching, as well as his commitment to ending long-term immigrant detention and reliance on private detention centers. What is that going to look like, and what will be put in place? On the border, I don't think this at all can be a day one really approach. And in general, it's good to think about what should be first, but with COVID and with economic crisis, the Biden administration is going to be really busy on a lot of fronts. But on the border, there's just a really huge challenge. The Biden, incoming administration has said that they'll end the Remain in Mexico, the MPP program, but what does that look like? How will people be brought back into the country who've been waiting in Mexico? And how can we fundamentally change the asylum system so that if there are large numbers of people coming again across the border to seek asylum, we don't see the chaos and people in, you know, terrible conditions and Border Patrol stations, and the breakdown in communication between different parts of government, and the really slow processing and the ballooning immigration court backlog that asylum seekers are being put into. We've been thinking a lot at the Migration Policy Institute about how to achieve longer term reform of the asylum system and how to achieve faster processing of asylum seekers while still ensuring due process, so that people who have valid asylum claims, according to our, you know, quite narrow definition of asylum, can get that protection quickly, and people who don't meet those criteria get an answer quickly as well, and are not spending years in the country before finally getting that no answer. And just how to improve the processing so that, you know, people are in a humane situation, things are efficient, things are transparent, and humanitarian as asylum seekers come in. So, you know, while I think there's a lot of hopes among many that the Biden administration will quickly change the asylum system and quickly, you know, restore a commitment to humanitarian protection, things may be a bit slower because there's a lot of work in the background that needs to be done to get a new system in place in order to handle claims well. I think another piece that I hope starts on day one is just reform at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Under the Trump administration, we've seen, you know, longer and longer applications for all kinds of benefits. We've seen increased vetting, increased interview requirements, increased requests for evidence from applicants, you know, higher denial rates, slower processing times. All of that is costing USCIS a lot of money. It's making people wait in long lines. It's making the country wait to get immigrants who can contribute for longer amounts of time. So, you know, how can USCIS streamline and, again, you know, focus on transparency, focus on customer service, focus on getting desired immigrants into the country quickly, as long as they meet desired criteria. Of course, we need vetting. You know, we need to protect our national security. We need to make sure that people qualify for the immigration benefits that they're applying for. But we've seen, you know, many layers of increased vetting and scrutiny that don't really seem to be achieving much in the way of detecting problems. They're just, you know, creating a lot of costs and delays. So that reform at USCIS, I think, would be important. And I think that John covered many of the other things that I would think about. I think particularly on temporary protected status, you know, there are hundreds of thousands of people who have TPS today because of court action that's keeping TPS on life support. You know, whether or not Congress has the will to provide those folks a path to permanent legal status, you know, what would a President Biden do for TPS holders? Would he restore the program as it is? Would he use a new pandemic basis for awarding TPS? You know, and how will this administration respond also to the devastating hurricanes that have just hit Central America and communities in need because of that? So those are some of the things that we're watching, and I'm curious to hear what the other panelists have to say as well.
Great, thank you, Julia. So we'll hear now from Tony.
Going after both of you, there's not much left for me to, not much meat on the bone there for me to gnaw on, but I just want to go back to TPS, which was born in Nicaragua, and extending TPS is very important. When you talk about separated families, we don't think of it in terms of TPS. I think it's almost 280,000 US citizen children under the age of 18 have been born over the last two decades of TPS to parents or family members that are part of TPS. So you think about that impact in terms of separating additional families. I think the other part is, and so I would love to see some legislation that would provide more long-term TPS holders with permanent resident status and the possibility of citizenship, and also to hopefully reform the system to avoid repetition of what's happened again. And thank you for mentioning the storms in Central America, because they have hit many of our home countries. And let's not forget, climate change is what caused those problems ultimately. The other thing is a lot of the undocumented agriculture and health workers, you know, have been critical, and that's thank you, Krish, for mentioning that our hashtag Mass for Farm Workers with Monica Ramirez and the Justice for Migrant Women. It's actually now 2 million masks that were put on farm workers during COVID. Think of the importance every time you take a meal or get nourished in the safety of our homes, and the incredible risk that they put themselves at so that we can eat safely. So it would be great to support legislation that will allow them to earn permanent resident status and possible citizenship in terms of essential workers like that. So I think that, the other things I think have been mentioned, so I don't want to repeat them. And I certainly can expound on your expertise. But supporting healthcare workers, and there's a lot of things that I think is are really important to, to get going.
Thank you, Tony. Lee, this question's for you. When can we start accepting immigrants and refugees, and what are resettlement agencies doing to prepare their infrastructure?
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. I think the other panelists did a great job in kind of highlighting a number of the issues from, looking at the executive orders and proclamations. I mean, certainly, again, as John mentioned, we'd love to see the repeal of the Muslim ban executive order, the enhanced vetting executive order, and a series of proclamations that are negatively impacting refugee resettlement. Some of the steps the Biden administration can take, the rescinding of executive orders and proclamations, obviously will have an immediate impact. As John said, the administrative rule changes will take a little longer. But it's also important to note that it will take some time for agency capacity to rebuild and for processing to resume prior levels of activity. And as others have mentioned, the pandemic is also exacerbating the situation quite a bit. So, for example, the last number I heard was that there are a couple of hundred open refugee corps and asylum corps positions open at USCIS. And these are the people who conduct the refugee and asylee interviews, and that's a critical step in the adjudication process. Over the last couple of years, a significant number of refugee corps officers have been seconded to the asylum team, and that also negatively impacts refugee processing. There are overseas refugee support centers that collect refugee candidate data and coordinate the pipeline process have been significantly downsized over the past 4 years, and so they need to hire and train staff to rebuild capacity. And I assume, as it comes to refugees, it will take some time period for UNHCR to restart the referral process to increase the number of kids or the number of refugee candidates. I'd also mention that looking at refugees in particular, that the current pipeline for people in the vetting process for resettlement in the United States numbers just a little over 100,000 at this point. And most of the people are at the pre-USCIS in-person interview phase. And USCIS has already stated that they will not send out Refugee Corps staff out on circuit rides until the third quarter of FY21. So we have a relatively small cohort of people who are ready to get on planes at this point through the Refugee Resettlement Program. I just want to note a couple of things as well. Just point out that for the unaccompanied kids, there's a potential issue that Julia started to talk about. ORR, the acting director of ORR, just recently submitted a declaration in the PJES v. Wolf case, and that's the class action lawsuit challenging the Trump administration on behalf of unaccompanied kids who are seeking protection in the United States. And in that declaration, the director stated that due to COVID safety protocols, ORR's shelter bed capacity has been reduced by about 40%. And so they are predicting that the bed capacity, they will reach their maximum within the next few weeks to months. And ORR is using the shelter facilities down along the border as kind of a staging area for quarantining the kids before sending them on to other shelters across the country. So, that presents a problem, a potential problem that Julia touched on in terms of how to mitigate COVID spread among the kids from the border as they travel to other areas of the country. It was interesting, just this morning in the Washington Post, there was an article on all of these steps or potential steps for the incoming administration to take to reverse Trump administration immigration actions. And unnamed sources stated that the potential to keep Title 42 in place for some period of time is under consideration so as to avoid the border emergency. So while from a policy perspective, a number of steps can be taken in the relative short term, I think we also need to consider all of these different capacity building or rebuilding steps that need to take place within agencies, as well as within agencies that help the unaccompanied kids, as well as the refugee resettlement agencies as well.
Great, thank you, Lee. So as we all know, 2 Georgia runoff races in January will decide control of the Senate. And so if Republicans maintain those seats, we expect it will be more difficult for President-elect Biden to advance an immigration agenda. So Julia, I want to direct this question to you. What is the potential for legislative action on immigration under a Republican-controlled Senate? And then obviously, John, would welcome your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, as John said, even if Democrats get control of the Senate, or if it's tied with Kamala Harris as the tiebreaker, it will take bipartisanship to achieve any legislative reform on immigration. On the one hand, we have a lot of reason for pessimism. We've seen Congress fail to act on immigration and fail to pass immigration bills, in 2005, 6, 7, in 2010, in 2013, in recent years, talking about DACA. So this is an incredibly tough policy area for Congress, and Congress in general has been finding it hard to pass legislation other than, funding bills that must pass. On the other hand, as John mentioned, the House, with strong bipartisan support, passed this farm worker bill that would have given legal status to farm workers and reformed the program. And we've also seen, both the House and the Senate now pass a bill to remove per country caps. The fate of that seems pretty uncertain at this point, but it just shows that there are some pieces of immigration legislation that can get through. I think, maybe there's room, I don't know, but maybe there's room for getting some immigration measures into COVID relief bills or into spending bills next year, into some of that must pass legislation. Otherwise, I think it's going to be a difficult conversation. I mean, Biden has committed to introducing a bill to legalize the 11 million, as you mentioned, Krish, but that's going to be a marker bill. That's going to be a wish list of what the Democrats hope for, but something that's not likely to be able to be passed into law. And that will be the beginning of a conversation. It also matters what happens with DACA. Right now, there's a court case in Texas, a judge who is, who overturned the DAPA program that would have given legal status to parents of Dreamers. And if he rules that the DACA program was illegally established, that could create, again, a new incentive for Congress to tackle the issue of the legal status of Dreamers. We'll have to see how that shakes out and how that relates to whatever, President-elect Biden would want to establish on DACA, and whether, his administration could find a way to establish a program in a way that would survive that legal challenge or get around that legal challenge. But that's certainly a place, legal status for Dreamers is something that there's strong public support for. And I think, among members of Congress, strong bipartisan support for, but it always comes down to what are the other provisions in a trade-off bill. And that's where the rubber meets the road and deals tend to fall apart. But with a supportive White House, perhaps there's a greater chance than we've seen in recent years.
Julia, I'm glad you mentioned the Judge Hainan issue down in the Southern District of Texas, because that could be, I fully agree, the action forcing event that brings the president, or in this case, President-elect Biden, but once he's sworn in, President Biden working with a divided Congress to get something done. The one thing that, Joe Biden can make deals. I never felt that President Trump really was intent on making a deal for Dreamers and TPS recipients. I was cautiously optimistic in February, and then that all fell apart in a very colorful way. And I just, the thing that you had back in, the 112, 113 Congress, when I was there, you look at that situation, and one thing that was lacking was real presidential leadership. Now, the thought process back then was, well, President Obama can be very divisive. Having him in the background may be the best thing to do. I firmly believe that in order to get immigration done, because it's so thorny, you need to have effective presidential leadership to make it done. You need that president to come in there and tell the opposition, listen, I need to get this, I will give you that. And then, you have to deal with your own caucus saying, listen, this is the deal that we have to deal with right now. If you want to push and add all these other things in here, it can all fall apart. But right now we have a deal. That's where the president needs to come in and be that figure who can make things happen. Where I see a possibility for a Democrat-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate to come together is if you have that type of effective presidential leadership. Now, it could be on a broader bill. I agree with you that I think whatever bill they're going to have early on is going to be a show bill. It's not going to be a go bill. Go bills take time. They take preparation. They take a lot of back and forth, a lot of horse trading. That to me is something that can happen. And usually I'm the Debbie Downer in these panels, but I truly believe that something can happen. It all depends, like the process is going to matter. If Republicans feel that they're being dealt with, getting stiff-armed here and there, yeah, there's not going to be much that's going to happen. But if you have someone that's leading the charge in a way that balances interests, and you have a package, now it may not be everything that everyone wants, but to me, that's going to be critically important, not just for now, but also the future. Because and I'm saying this as the recovering Tea Partier at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, but if you've got Republicans who can vote on an immigration package, it gets taken care, it passes, it becomes law, and then they can run for re-election and win on it. That's the type of thing that's going to get other folks to say, you know what, maybe this isn't as thorny an issue as we thought it was. And I can come out of my shell a little bit, and I can feel free to, whether I don't vote, yes on the final passage, maybe I can vote yes on cloture. Or maybe I can vote yes for this amendment and that amendment, and that can help make the bill better. So that's where I see the possibilities for things happening.
Great, thank you, John. So one last question before we go to Q&A. I know we only have a little while left, but Tony, in collaborating with various groups, particularly youth over the years, what do you believe has been effective in helping to change the narrative about the need for immigration reform? What can we learn from less successful efforts moving forward?
Thank you for that question. The immigration rights movement over the last decade has been essentially shaped by the creative organizing of young people. DACA was achieved because young people who's directly impacted refused to take no for an answer. And that resilience, that ability to be able to be malleable and as an answer, and subsequently they have fought every step of the way to keep it in place, going into the halls of Congress, into the courts, in the streets, to change the narrative of who dreamers are. And they've done a really good job. We can't downplay the role of social media that was coming around in terms of owning their own narrative and creating it. And it's resulted, last I checked, it was about an 80% support among all Americans. That was very different when it came to unaccompanied minors, when it came to America's view of caravans, because they owned their narrative. It wasn't being put out there by someone else as much as others tried. Also, young people have refused to allow the immigrant community to be divided. It's very easy for that to happen. They've refused politicians' attempts to use them as bargaining chips, and for the most part, refused to carve out a legalization strategy that would provide protection for themselves at the expense of others who are also part of la lucha, the struggle. For example, like TPS or DED holders. I've been in closed rooms with DACA recipients that are talking about those that can't even apply for DACA, that are also in need of a pathway. So young immigrant youth have been clear at changing the environment and conditions on school grounds, college campuses that are inclusive of undocumented immigrants. Sanctuary, safe zone policies were championed by immigrant youth. And I have to tell you, within our organization, we worked for Trinity University and my friend Juan Sepulveda to create a leadership institute exclusively for DACA recipients. They weren't all Latino. they were from all over the world. And what was interesting is the commonality that they had. The biggest thing they said is, we don't have to explain anything. We also don't have to be patted on the head as cute little DACA recipients. That there's an understanding and a commonality, and that's what we're going to need to see. And as well as entrepreneurial trainings. I mean, that's one of the things that's so key to all of this, is how to create your own path. And taking a look at what life without DACA, that were being spearheaded by immigrant youth. There was a movement to think creatively about all those options. Immigrant youth weren't sitting around in case DACA was successfully terminated. They were self-organizing with the thought that if it happened, what's the next move? We even saw a greater number of immigrant youth registering voters, which is remarkable to me. You can't even vote, but you understand that whoever you can get to vote can represent your cause and your ideals. And they're canvassing and turning out voter polls. And that's what was remarkable to me, being involved in the American process. That's as American as you can get. So the next 2 years, I think, will be critical in harnessing that energy to lead to systematic reform immigration policies that are inclusive. And we have to hold the Biden administration, whatever the Senate looks like, to that standard. I think in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, we had very optimistic thoughts of what was going to happen in immigration after those battles. So we can't let up now.
Great. Thank you, Tony, for those really helpful, insightful remarks. So now turning to question and answers from the audience. I know we have limited time, so I'll try to go through them quickly. First question, I will use moderator prerogative to briefly answer. It's from Michael. Recognizing that LIRS emphasis is on fair policies for immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers arriving in the U.S. or those already here, do you also advocate for development assistance and other programs that help mitigate the need for people to leave their home countries in the first place? And the short answer is absolutely. Our view is that it ought to be a choice as opposed to a life necessity. The sad or tragedy of the last 4 years has been an administration that has both shut the borders as well as shut down assistance. We believe that migration really should be a last resort as opposed to, just what we've seen in the last several years. Another question that I'll direct to Lee, this is from Pastor Mike. How can LIRS and its allies tell our stories in ways to persuade the middle of the U.S. Senate, of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives to support our legislative and administrative agenda?
So throughout most of the history of the refugee resettlement program and all that, it has had broad bipartisan support. That has diminished somewhat over the last few years, but the resettlement agencies and advocates in this space are working to try and rebuild that. And we hope to continue to have that increase over the next coming years. It is the stories that we have to tell of our clients' successes and the benefits that our clients bring to their communities are so compelling that is the best way to really help change opinions, is to introduce people to the successes of the people that we work with and the productive lives they lead and the benefits they bring to the communities where they are establishing their new lives.
Great. Okay. And for this round, I'm going to try to throw out a few questions and then just hope people can quickly, succinctly answer. One question comes from Christine. Should the U.S. broaden asylum requirements? If so, what new criteria would you add? Another question is from Bonnie. What about reform in Customs and Border Patrol? And then another question is from Jim. Is there any analysis of the economic benefit of the 11 million illegal immigrants in the U.S.? Any takers?
I can start really quickly on reform of customs and border protection. I think, we've seen a drastic change in who's coming to the border in the United States. It used to be that border crossers were young Mexican men, primarily coming alone, who were seeking to evade Border Patrol detection and get into the United States and work. And now in recent years, of course, we've seen an increase in families, an increase in Central American families in particular, who are not trying to seek, not trying to evade Border Patrol, but actually to find a Border Patrol agent and ask for protection in the United States. Our border control infrastructure has not changed in response to that, or at least not nearly enough. So we think there's a lot of work to be done to keep the whole border control, border management infrastructure relevant to today's concerns. With more and more children coming across the border, we need staffing and facilities that are appropriate for children and that provide the protections that are needed. If more and more people are not, trying to get across the border without detection, we need to, put the staffing in the right places, not be investing more and more in fencing or in, in agents trying to capture people, but in, the staffing that can manage the flows that are coming. So I think there is definitely a need for reform in that area.
Great. And did I hear anyone else who wanted to respond before I ask the final round of questions?
Krish, I can't remember everything you asked in the question about the benefit of having 11 million unauthorized individuals in the country. Now, there's an awful lot of economic literature that talks about the benefit of legalizing these individuals. And as someone who is from upstate New York, I can tell you that when places lose people, it's not a good look. I'm from Albany. Like, Schenectady was a lot better when you had a massive GE plant and a lot of folks worked there. I went to college at Syracuse. They used to have I think it was Lockheed. They had, I think, ExxonMobil. They also had Carrier. Those factories are gone. Xerox and Kodak in Rochester, Honeywell and various other companies in Buffalo. You don't want to have people leave. You want to be a place where people want to go to. Do we want to have unauthorized migrants? No, we don't want to have large-scale unauthorized migration to the U.S. We need to have a system that allows folks to come here when they want to come here, make it orderly, make sure that we know who's here. It's better to know who's here than not knowing who's here. So, and this gets into the whole need for comprehensive immigration reform, or do you want to do something smaller here, bigger here? Whatever it may be, we need to have an immigration system that functions a lot better than what we have today. I know you were looking for succinct, there's succinct.
Perfect. No, appreciate it. Wonderful. Which allows us to ask just one final set of questions. And I think these are really about individual action, so I'm grouping them together. One is from David. Given that Congress is likely to be divided, are there any bipartisan efforts we can get behind? And another question from Christine, will LIRS be organizing opportunities for private citizens not aligned with any organizations other than yours to advocate for specific laws and policies? I want to help.
Well, there's a few things that the Chamber would love help on. The Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act, which in the Senate is being led by David Perdue and Dick Durbin, would allow for the recapture of, I believe it's 40,000 immigrant visas. We could use those for doctors and nurses, which we desperately need. Other efforts that we hope would get more traction in the next Congress. There is the Lloyd Smucker bill. I believe it's HR 1740. Forgive me if I'm getting the bill number wrong, but it was a Workforce for an Expanding Economy Act. Once again, small piece, it's bipartisan. These are the types of things that if we're ever going to get a reform package done, we need to have members of Congress that typically don't work together and may not be, the face of the immigration debate. Typically, we need to have those folks involved. The more they get involved, the more they realize that they can address these issues and not pay a political price for it. That's what's going to help build the confidence in these members that they can stick their necks out, they can try to move things, and they can actually get a job done. And they'll be rewarded for it by their constituents. not vilified for it. Those are a couple bills. There's going to be an awful lot of things moving forward. So for those that want to help, I'm happy to work with you and Krish and Diana, whoever this is, if they have their email address, please feel free to pass them along to me.
That's wonderful, and a great way to segue into our conclusion. As we articulated at the outset in terms of LIRS's perspective, and as you could tell from this conversation, there is a great deal of consensus in terms of the priorities for day one, for the first 100 days, and for the next 4 years. So please do stay in touch, because there is very much going to be a lot of energy, I believe some real momentum where private citizens, individuals can take action. So just, please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists, John, Julia, Tony, and Lee. Thank you for joining in our conversation today. I really do think, as today's conversation made clear, this is an exciting but challenging time in the immigration space. We really do look forward to working together to reverse the worst of the damage done to our immigration system, but we are mindful of what lies ahead. Immigration has unfortunately become an incredibly divisive issue in this country and on Capitol Hill, despite its popular support. But we truly believe that we can work across the aisle to build a system that lives up to our American ideals and proves that we are stronger together. So please please know that we are always available to answer immigration policy questions, and we encourage you to learn more by visiting our website, lirs.org, as well as following us on social media. I know that there were many questions that we couldn't get to, but I think that just speaks to the fruitful nature of having these conversations now as we look to January. So really, to every single panelist, thank you so much. And thanks to our audience for joining. Look forward to the next conversation. Take care.